All right, welcome everybody to the Political Theory Institute's summer event. I've got a real treat for you. Before I get into this, I want to mention the fall lineup for fall of 2021. We've got September 16th, Stephen Knott, United States Naval War College, on the political and constitutional thought of Alexander Hamilton. That's our Constitution Day lecture. That should be a lot of fun and very interesting. On October 7th, special treat, we've got Sophie Marcotte-Chenard of Carleton University on what can we learn from political history? Strauss and Aron on Thucydides, in conversation with Alan Vine. On October 25th, we've got Francis Fukuyama of Stanford on populism, polarization, and national identity. Also in conversation with Alan Vine, we've got on November 11th, Annika Prather, founder of the Living Water School, on the Black classical tradition. That will be our Lincoln Scholars lecture. Really looking forward to that. That's in conversation with Tom Merrill. And then on December 2nd, we've got Benjamin and Jenna Story of Fermi University on Why We Are Restless, the Modern Quest for Contentment. And that'll be with my colleague Alan as well. So tonight, we've got a special treat. We've got Wes Yang here speaking with us. He's the author of The Souls of Yellow Folk, which was selected as a notable book of 2018 by the New York Times and also by the Washington Post, and as one of the best books of the year by The Spectator and Publishers Weekly. Wesley Yang is a columnist for Tablet Magazine and a contributing editor for Esquire. Sorry, I'm getting notes. His Substack, The Year Zero, is dedicated to an investigation of what he's going to be talking with us about tonight, and that's the successor ideology. So, Wesley, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your coming in to talk to us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So, there are a couple of basic categories of question I'd like to ask. One is the first is about theory. What is the theory of the successor ideology? What's the structure of this ideology? And the second set of questions is about how it's come to such prominence, how it's risen politically. So there's kind of a political science or sociology of knowledge question and a political theory question. So I guess to kick off the theory part, what is the successor ideology and how does it relate to, I mean, if this is the new left, how does this relate to the old new left and earlier forms of progressivism?
So the term is a kind of synthetic term of convenience that is invented by me, and it still is in a kind of intermediate phase where it's largely just a thing myself and my private interlocutors use to describe the thing that we all know exists and that is exerting so much sort of energy and pressure on the white collar workplace, on journalism, the culture industries, without it having a name, right? Or, you know, sort of there are names that are partisan, that, you know, it calls itself social justice. And then there are sort of hostile names that have a somewhat spoiled provenance, right? Like cultural Marxism, you know, which sort of was you know, invented by, you know, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. And but we do all agree that that there is a politics in a new key, and it's heavily moralized. It relies on the sort of capture of institutions by means of claims of harm, and of a sort of conflation of the idea of a kind of conceptual violence, right? And so the way that I describe it at a very high level of, you know, at a very high level, is to say that it calls simultaneously for, you know, a radically less disciplinary society of the street. And so the attempt to sort of close racial disparities in policing, results in a rhetoric of prison and police abolition on the one hand. And then on the other hand, a radically more disciplinary society of the workplace, the boardroom, and the bedroom, where the sort of real harms of our society require, surveillance by administrative authorities. The sort of paradigmatic example of this is the Title IX system. There was a dramatic expansion in the level and the degree of oversight of student-teacher relations beginning around 2013, amidst a claims coming from the vice president and the president of a campus rape crisis that we're in, that happened to coincide with statistics showing that just a few years before, the rate at which rape and sexual assault were being, reported had decreased by 85% over the previous 30 years, right? But suddenly, right, like, so in 2008, there was a book called The End of Men that opened with a chapter that sort of began talking about the emergence of the hookup culture and how it sort of fit with the desires of young female college graduates, and spoke about this dramatic, right, like drop in and the dramatic increase in safety just a few years before the rhetoric then becomes about a crisis requiring emergency means, and the means that were adopted were in fact adopted through an administratively, and of course, here's the political theory aspect of it, rather lawless process, right, where there is a kind of you're supposed to go through a comment period, and you're supposed to say what the rules are, and what the Department of Education instead decided to do, the Office of Civil Rights within it, was to send a letter saying, we have the authority to pull your funding unless you go ahead with moving ahead with processes that include, in many cases, not telling the accused what they are accused of, not telling them the identity of their accusers, not giving them access to the evidence, such that, there were a group of 4 female, feminist identified law professors that I wrote a piece about in the Chronicle of Higher Education, who wrote a letter saying the degree of unfairness in this process is shocking. And I wrote about them because it was possible to write about it through them, because they were given the deference, the sort of identitarian deference, to be able to speak about fair process and the rule of law, and they spoke in no uncertain terms, and they are authoritative figures on this subject. But immediately, their statements were construed by many as sort of putting them on the side of rapists, right? And so all of this is an early sort of precursor of this new politics of a new key. It has all of the different elements, right? Like, there's a form of wrongdoing. There's a claim that we're in the midst of the crisis, a claim that a state of exception exists that calls for unusual measures that sort of deny people what we've come to think of as the constituents of fair process, in deference to that state of exception that we happen to live in, contradicted by the actual data about the actual commission or reporting of the crime, and the warrant to do so on the basis of an idea of sort of psychological vulnerability and harm, because to give the accused the elements of fair process, such as to allow them to see the evidence, to know who is accusing them, and to cross-examine them, for instance, would be itself a form of re-victimization that would be part of the process that we then have to avoid. And so this is like one example of, you posit a form of wrongdoing, you take shortcuts around the usual processes. All of this is justified by a rhetoric of crisis. And the remedy turns out to be promulgating definitions of assault and harassment. And a piece by female Harvard law professor Jeannie Sutton-Gerson, she reached the conclusion after analyzing a lot of these rules that were put into place that that basically everything students do is in fact prohibited, right? Like almost nothing they do. So it's a certain approach where you prohibit everything, and then in the presence of an aggrieved party, we have not subtly, but we have in fact overtly shifted the burden, onto the accused to demonstrate their innocence. And this is it's pretty remarkable that this was done. It was done through mid-level bureaucrats operating within the federal government. And so these are figures that are not subject to any kind of democratic debate, but they had behind them the voice of the president, the voice of Joe Biden. And so the combination of those things made it so that another professor, Janet Halley, told me that the irregular method, just sending out a letter threatening everyone, right, that with potential removal of their funding, she said no judge in America would have, if any college had contested it. But we created this environment of such heavily that no college is going to be seen as going up to bat for rapists, right? And so the combination of really expansive definitions of wrongdoing and harm, presumptions of guilt, all that together, created a kind of model repressive / reformatory apparatus, because the idea was to spread new norms, new definitions of consent, and to eventually do something that, I think one of the most important documents of that time was an op-ed in the magazine Vice that tells us about the nature of the successor ideology in general, by the journalist Ezra Klein, right? And its headline was, "Yes means yes," which is the idea of affirmative consent and the idea that anything that you have not explicitly had a spoken agreement about is presumptively an act of non-consensual sex and thus an act of rape, that shifts the burden of all the way onto the accused. He says, well, it's a bad law. Yes, is a terrible law. That's what he said, and I support it completely. Right, and then so he goes on to say that, like, yes, of course, we all know that due process consists of these principles of knowing what you're accused of, and ultimately, like, being able to demonstrate your innocence, right? Like, there has to be a clear standard where if I do A, B, and C, and I don't do X, Y, and Z, I haven't done anything wrong. Right. Even in the presence of so the method that was used here was actually to create a Leviathan where consent actually became formally and practically impossible. And right, so you have this kind of utilitarian logic taking over the logic of our criminal justice system, where the individual, right, like has a particular set of rights. Where we can, and so he goes on to make the case for the utilitarian logic. He says, like, this is such a crisis that men have to feel what he says, a cold spike of fear before proceeding, and that's going to be the only thing that's going to really beat back, right, the abuses. And so the kind of seductiveness of that, the very sort of compelling speciousness. And part of that speciousness is this is kind of true in a way, right? Like, oh, like if like the person likes you, like in the end, they're not going to report you, right? But in fact, sort of the law professors went on to document, and it has since been more documented, that in fact what it has produced is a heavily racially disproportionate, right, share of those who are accused, and so there was a great moment on a Vox podcast where they were going over this uncomfortable fact, right? Like we we produce this apparatus of protection to help women, and a lot of Black and Hispanic men are now being accused at a much greater rate than anyone else. And then the other woman responded to that by saying, well, what if we just made this apply to white men, right? And her interlocutor sort of had to sort of bring her up for air, and she sort of caught herself, but she was being carried along by the underlying momentum of this thing called the successor ideology, right? Which holds that, if I were to define it at a very high level, which holds that there is such a thing called Eurocentric cis hetero patriarchy, right? That it is our purpose as activists, and then our purpose as a society to dismantle, right? And so this of course is the end result of a kind of academic parlor game that we are all familiar with. It started in the 70s, it continued in the 80s, and so there's always in response, right, to any critique of a certain injustice, well, what about the disabled? What about the intersection of the disabled and the Black? What about, and all of that has been reconciled in this new language that posits a unity of all oppression, right? And that suggests that, like, the oppression exists at all levels. It exists at a micro level and at a macro level. So, oppression takes the form of, white supremacy, which there's a tablet article by this guy, Jamie Kirchick, where he notes the fact that the New York Times printed the word white supremacy 70 times in the year 2010, and more than 700 by October of 2020 in that year. Did the incidence of this thing multiply by a factor of 10 in that time? And the answer to that is, yes, it did, because we redefined it, right? In just the same way that we redefined, right? So, like, the way you arrive at the study that says, 1 in 4 women have been raped, and this is, of course, is a figure that is multiples higher than the rate in war zones, right? So, like, so women who, we did it by defining sexual assault as including unwanted touching over the clothes, right? Like, they gave out a questionnaire, and we asked people what had happened to them, and we gave them a rubric of what it meant, and we arrived at the figure, right? And so similarly, like, did white supremacy grow? Yes, because white supremacy now also refers to why the Oscars are so white, right? It also refers to the shades of the makeup at the makeup counter of mascara are normed to a majority European descended population. And so we now are just as white supremacists as we ever were, despite the fact that we did, in fact, right, in 1964 or 1965, we dismantled the overt, legal manifestations of this regime in much the same way that, sort of patriarchy once, to a generation of prior feminist reformers meant, right, like, as recently as the early 1970s, you needed a man's signature, right, to get a credit card, and the separation of property within a marriage, did not in fact exist, and as a practical matter, domestic violence was not in fact recognized, right, as a crime in which the state had a role in fighting, and so that all ceased to be true through periods of, feminist legal reform in the 1970s and the 1980s, just as, as recently as 1967, right? Like, there were laws in this country, forbidding, there were state laws forbidding miscegenation, right? Like interracial marriages. And it wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court said, no, this is actually not consistent with our understanding of the Constitution. And so in that sense, like, the country was overtly white supremacist, but it meant what it meant. Today, there has been, a process of saying that, we have redefined it to mean the things that I've just, the trivial things that I've referred to, but also ultimately, it takes us to the moment of the emergence of Kendiism, right? Of sort of like the Ibram Kendi, whose two formulations, right, that one cannot be non-racist, one can either be racist or anti-racist, and the doctrine that wherever there are disparities, there is racism, and wherever there is racist policy producing those disparities in outcome, the remedy to past discrimination, which can be the only explanation for why there are racially disparate outcomes, is present discrimination in the future. Now, this is, of course, on the one hand, just a version of the argument on behalf of affirmative action, but it's a purified version that sort of cleans out all the hesitancy and the sort of conceptual murk, right, that behind the way the court eventually allowed us to produce it in a way that is relatively constrained. And it's a call for a push toward ever more overt engineering of outcomes by race and gender. And we actually saw this start to happen, with the start of the Biden administration. There was this question about like, will this actually mean that there can be a pushback against the excesses of wokeness? Will it actually mean that this person who was elected in no small part, I believe, chosen by the primary electorate, that he was the least sort of woke, right, of the candidates? Right. And the answer is, the answer is that the administration, they distributed grants and loan forgiveness to farmers by race, and of course there's an argument on behalf of it based upon prior abuses. There was a previous finding of discriminatory policy. A judge, rolled back that decision, and said that it's issued an injunction. And in another case, small business loans were being prioritized for certain designated protected categories of person. So successor ideology really is the politics that emerges from the sort of ordinary operations of a system that is increasingly starting to use government power to distribute various goods on the basis of identity. The state of Vermont went further than anything the Biden administration did in simply sort of declaring at a certain point, at a point where you had to be over the age of 55 as a white person to have access to the vaccine, that anyone over the age of 18 who BIPOC, right, like the new sort of term for non-white people, had access. So this is, the judges, and I think in both cases, conservative judges ruled with the SBA loans and the, that this does not pass constitutional muster. There's a stronger case to be made on behalf of those things, that I don't think there's any construction of strict scrutiny that says you can give medicines out on the basis of race, right? Like there's an argument you can make on it, but like it's never, you can, and of course there's arguments for efficiency to be made for it. It's a small population. It amounted to a couple of weeks, but they crossed the Rubicon, and they showed a willingness to defy pretty much what for the last few decades has been a settled understanding of the degree to which you can take race into account in the distribution of rewards and of harms, right?
Bakke was kind of a big compromise, right? I mean, Bakke, you've got this difficult problem. You've got the 14th Amendment and equality before the law, and you've got a history of race oppression. And so those cases were an attempt to square a circle. And so they had to do it in this sort of awkward, very imperfect way. And so that's the source of the murk within the liberal framework. But
it's also like it keeps it kind of moderate. It keeps it sort of, and so successor ideology in practice is all of this prior sort of engineering of the limits of acceptable opinion and so on that happened really starting in 2015. Like, so to give an example, like, if you were following this back then, sort of diversicrats, right, at the University of Maryland sort of decreed that the proper usage, what is for a person who is here without papers, is undocumented citizen, right? And so like that's a kind of oxymoron,
Right.
but it also indicates a will to open borders, right?
Right.
Like, so like in theory, if you can get people to start using that term, and if you can get people who dissent from that term to be sanctioned by
Stigmatized.
social pressure or just
Right.
framed as a fascist, right?
Right.
Simply by virtue of wanting to maintain the distinction between the documented and the undocumented that is constitutive of the category of citizenship itself, right? If you want to do that, you can just police this debate out of existence, right? And then right around that same time, you see Berkeley issued an enumerated list of racial microaggressions, and among them were included, like, I think the best person should get the job, right? And so this means that the debate over meritocracy has been policed out of existence in much the same way that like certain kinds of discussion have been policed out of existence. So Judy Sutgerson also wrote a piece for the New Yorker about how law professors were at that time becoming very wary of teaching the law of sexual assault, right? Because the way you teach a law in a classroom is you talk about cases, you talk about hypothetical instances, you talk about hypothetical defenses, right? And so the new grounds for saying that we can't do this is emotional harm, re-victimization, emotional harm even coming from a hypothetical case, right? So that trigger us, right? And so similarly, and this is also a cultural phenomenon, right? Like, so the San Francisco Board of Education, they voted to paint over or cover over a mural, an American history mural that showed George Washington and a dead Indian and a slave, right, among other things. And this was a mural that was done, funded by the WPA. It was done by a communist in the sort of Diego Rivera style, and the whole purpose of it was very consistent with the 1619 project and this sort of critical reexamination of the violence and the subjugation inherent in American history. Right. But today's leftists who've made the ideological succession say it has to go down because it does not matter what the intention of that artist was. We know what the intention of that artist was. His intention is in fact salutary according to our views. Nonetheless, it inflicts, its very existence on the wall inflicts emotional and psychological trauma on Black and Hispanic students. And so what is distinctive here, again, is a new form of policing and a new form of engineering consensus on the basis of concepts of theoretical, of psychological harm. And a conflation of psychological harm with violence itself. The Times ran an op-ed by some activist / neuroscientist who argued that difficult words can exert the same destructive effect on someone's psyches as an actual physical act of violence, right? But then again, of course, like during the protests, right, sort of acts of arson were seen as a form of speech that, and the voice of the oppressed. So we have this, we have these kind of like new ideas, right, about the scope of speech, about the role in protecting people from harm, all of which are actually tied to various political agendas that can be described in the following terms. And so when I speak of the successor ideology, we see this kind of recrudescence of activists who refer to themselves as abolitionists, right? And when they say that there's abolitionists, usually they mean they're prison abolitionists or they're police abolitionists. But And so there's, a book I'm going to be writing about on my Substack by Andrew Delbanco, who wrote a book called The Abolitionist Imagination. And he sort of argues that, there's this recurrent tendency within American life, right, where a moral vanguard constitutes itself as being in the midst of a great moral emergency and creating a state of exception that justifies and in fact places a moral mandate upon them to eradicate a great evil in our midst at any cost. And of course, the paradigmatic case of this were the abolitionists, who were originally a bunch of religious fanatics that were looked at askance by polite society, whose moral imagination had not been expanded to the point where they could see the great moral wrong in their midst. And indeed, there was a great moral wrong in their midst. It did, in fact, have to be destroyed at any cost. The cost at which it was eradicated was the 19th century's bloody war, the bloodiest war. And there's now a consensus in the United States that, of course, this was one of the great righteous causes through which America began to realize its promise of equality of all men. Although we did then, of course, step back from that, right? And we did not fulfill that promise, and it would not be fulfilled for another 100 years. But there is this argument, of course, that it wasn't even fulfilled then, right? And there's this argument that so Reconstruction gives way to Jim Crow. Jim Crow gives way to civil rights. Civil rights gives way to the war on crime and the growth of the mass incarceration state, a form of Jim Crow by another name.
Right.
And so that's a key point of the successor ideology. And of course, it's extended into other aspects of the culture. And so what's key to successor ideology is that it's unitary, and that the prison industrial complex partakes of the same energy, the same motives, and the same trans-historical, all-pervading white supremacy that accounts for the fact that the mascara at the makeup counter is not normed to non-white skin tones, right? And so it's a total.
So I just wanted to
it's a totalizing account.
Yeah.
And it's that totalizing account that also brings in, just as I was saying, not just race, not just gender, but the very existence of gender itself, right? And so the new abolition says that we actually are in the midst of a moral emergency, and that we have a class of people whose role it is to make us conscious of that moral emergency in our midst, and the remedy to it is nothing short of abolish masculinity, abolish whiteness, abolish differential outcomes on tests by abolishing tests, abolish morphological preferences, right, for
romantic tastes.
And so it's a thoroughgoing totalizing, all-encompassing ideology of a kind of radical egalitarianism that proceeds from such zeal to find out and hunt down sort of illegitimate hierarchies that remain in the world, such that, in my view, and I move from a descriptive to a normative statement here, that in fact it starts to cannibalize institutions without which a modern society can't exist, and it starts to cannibalize. It becomes increasingly difficult to articulate distinctions between better and worse, and between healthy and unhealthy, and so sort of a traditional progressive, with regard to the body positivity movement, would say well, we shouldn't be presenting, anorexic 15-year-olds as normative model, and everybody can agree with that. And we should not be unkind, to, people who have a BMI over a certain rate. The ideological succession, though, says that the harm psychologically to people on the basis of the maintenance of normative standards is greater than the harm of obesity itself. right? And therefore we have to, insist on the medical falsehood, right, that one can be healthy at any size.
Right. There's so I want to take a quick step back. Also, I just want to say for our audience, please post your questions in the Q&A in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A after in a little bit. And please identify yourself when you put your questions in the chat so we can read who's asking them. I'd like to go back a little bit to the parlor game. Not just because I'm in it, but it seems to me that an important part of this shift, there's some aspects of activism that clearly share a lineage with older versions of activism, such as prison abolition, kind of the old materialist tradition and critiques of American society. But through the 80s and 90s, particularly in the 90s, you had this shift, say, between, for those of you who are familiar with critical race theory, between, say, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, where the shift went from law and economics and politics to discourse. And on the basis of a postmodern critique of discourse along the lines of, Derrida and then Foucault, principally Foucault, a number of others, we get the view that social outcomes are part of a matrix of power encoded into the way people think and speak, and that this matrix has to be regarded as one whole system. And there seem to be, there's several moving parts, but the way that critical race theory took this was to look at the way that racial identity, and not just racial identity, but group identities of various kinds, are oppressed by virtue of such a system, that the discourse has encoded within it certain assumptions about different groups, and this predisposes millions of independent unconscious actors to behave in such a way that without any overt oppression happening, nevertheless, disparate outcomes are the result. And so there's a way in which clearly this shines a light on a lot of reality. There's a lot that's valuable about this insight, but it does set the stage for this kind of totalizing view that has to find a lot of people have written about the reductionism that seems to take place in, say, Kendi or D'Angelo. And it seems like the stage is set for that by critical race theory.
So there's this, this collection that came out in the I think the early 2000s called White Privilege, and it includes a bunch of essays that really provides the theoretical foundation of all this. We all go through a vast, and I'm quoting an essay by a Columbia University psychologist named Gerald Wing Su. And he would go
Father
on to
of microaggressions, right?
Yes, he would go on to write about the book called Microaggressions in Everyday Life. And he sort of stipulates that we all go through a vast socialization process that encodes a racial hierarchy within us, and it doesn't matter who we are or where we come from. So it's this powerful construct that is both unprovable and unfalsifiable, and that at some level feels true and feels urgently true to some people, and that sort of draws in that exerts a kind of gravitational pull on certain kinds of people who've had certain kinds of experiences, that may or may not be representative of the group as a whole. So you'll often see, polling data where people will say, like members of minority groups will say, like they will estimate to what degree they think this is a very racist country still, and then they will answer, well, to what extent have you yourself personally have been the victim of racism? And they'll be like a big gap, right? Many fewer of them will say that they themselves have experienced it, of course. But of course, we have kind of we have re-engineered the word not just to refer to naked animus, and
Right.
of course, and so there is a kind of sophistication in saying, it's the design of land use policies, and of course that's absolutely true, right?
Right.
Like the kind of the design of the suburbs is an engineered fact, and it was engineered in accordance with motives that were in some cases overtly racist, in other cases that simply ended up doing what one claims these things do, which is reproducing inequality and racial stratification without any intent to do so, right? So that's the issue. So we have this thing that is a useful way to look at things. It's when it hardens into dogma that it becomes a problem, right? And so to go back to an example of what it means for something to harden into dogma, the example that I wrote about, the piece about the Harvard professors with the Title IX system, and there was a section where Nancy Gertner, who's a Harvard law professor and was, I believe, the first or the second woman named to the federal bench, and she was one of the women saying that this is a shockingly unfair system that you've just done, describes attending a meeting where people were being trained in trauma-informed investigation, right? And sort of the trauma, what they were told was that if the woman's account is inconsistent from telling to telling, if the details shift around, it means that the effect of the trauma was such that it confused her, and so the confusion is itself evidence that this thing happens. And sort of her response was, well, that's one potential, right, explanation. The other explanation is that she's not telling the truth, right? And so okay, so there's this novel therapeutic concept that names something that people recognize. And we say, well, you have to consider this possibility versus saying, establishing a dogma that what might be so must be so, right? And so the same kind of logic happens throughout the system, right? Where we're going to say, well, where there are disparities, there is racist policy, right? Rather than looking at other factors, and so moving around, sort of proceeding from dogmatic, proceeding from, a dogmatic is when these things harden and they become, in much the same way that kind of Kendi sort of strips away all the ambivalence and all of the constraints on our arguments for affirmative action and reveals the totalitarian potential in that system, unearthing new psychological forms of harm, or unearthing, totalizing monolithic systems of thought as explanatory of everything in practice, especially when married to the abolitionist, the sort of great moral emergency mindset, hardens into dogma and ends up, right, like leading people in the direction where they, where they reach conclusions that are just facially untrue, right? Like, and so.
Well, by the fourth, there's a way in which the logic kind of compels certain conclusions. So I want to read something, and I've lost the source, but this is Kimberly Crenshaw. She writes, "The question is not, did racism take place? For that is to be assumed. The question is how." So if you have a totalizing argument that that sees, there's a way in which the premise is that whiteness, which is to say race oppression, is the social cause as such. And if that's the social cause as such, then it's not a question of discovering whether it's active. You simply have to work your interpretation so as to produce that result. And there's a way in which prior to that, the shift from material consequences and causes, principally to causes, to discourse, means that speech can itself be harmed. And there's a way in which the self is constituted by discourse. And if the self is constituted by discourse, then the wrong kind of discourse is a kind of violence. And people then take it as a real violence. I remember, I think maybe the wildest thing I saw was somebody saying, and this is Twitter, right? So this isn't reality, but someone on Twitter saying that J.K. Rowling's statement that trans women, while they ought to be treated as well as women, nevertheless were not the same, that this was actual genocide. Yep. And the premise of that is that discourse is reality.
Right. I mean, you have a group of people who exist by virtue of a kind of social ascription, right? And so the denial of that social ascription. On the other hand, part of that social ascription, because it relies on a kind of medicalized authority, right, contains at its core a claim of inherency, right? And so, and a claim that the internal feeling that I have that tells me that I am one thing or another, is more real, right, than the gametes that I produce, right? And so the scientist who insists that in fact the gametes that you produce are decisive. Of course, we live in the medium of culture, and therefore, of course, we're all good liberals here, and we're going to ascribe, we're going to participate in whatever language game you want us to, right?
Right.
But part of that language game also entails the erasure of the terms of the game, right? And and the contradiction that is there, that you just tell this to anyone and they'll think of that contradiction, right? Like, has to be, you have to just suppress your awareness of that. And so the suppression has to take the form of policing. It has to take the form of consequences. And so if we believe, and so back in the 90s, right, there were these debates among leftists, right? And you had these like materialist leftists saying, sort of mocking the sterile scholasticism, right, of these professors who are not choosing to organize, who are not out there with the coal miners, who are instead writing these abstruse and rebarbative texts. And now we see who, see who was right. We see that there is an unreasonable effectiveness to discourse. Once we created a machine, social media, right, that created a whole new layer of discourse that vibrates around society and that is able to inflict consequences on people that touch them in the real world. The combination of this.
This is what I want to talk about next. Yeah, because this is fascinating. How because this is this is in one sense, this seems to be just an elite phenomenon. On the other hand, it seems to be tremendously powerful. There are people protesting school curricula. I'm not going to comment on the various bills that have been passed. There are 20 of them, so they vary a great deal in what they demand, but they indicate a certain popular resentment. So how did this happen? How did this go from being a debate between Katha Pollitt and Michel Foucault and turn into something that's out there in the streets? It seems like you've got a bunch of different stakeholders. Some of them are academic, some of them are journalists that were influenced by academics in school. You also seem to have various mediating fora. Twitter seems to be late in the game. I've heard that maybe Tumblr was the big thing. So how was this disseminated, and to whom, I guess is
no, but now we're at the level where professional organizations, right, are there's a certain kind of very plangent internal activism that it pretty much seems like no liberal organization can really resist. right? And so that, the American Medical Association recently, issued guidance that you should not put the sex of babies on their birth certificates, right?
That's right.
And there's an argument for the harm in that, and the concept of gender identity. I just read a book by Catherine, I forget her name, but she's a British philosopher who sort of does an enormously useful first chapter where she describes the lineage of the idea of gender identity, right, and gender expression. This idea that like you are what gender you are by virtue of an internal feeling that is more real than the gametes that you produce. And she shows that like this idea was articulated in a book in 2009, right? Like and she shows how Judith Butler before and so on. There's a lineage, but ultimately it doesn't fully get articulated in the rubric that we recognize today until 2009. And then sort of like a few years later, there's the the Caitlyn Jenner thing, and then 5 years later after that, right, Elizabeth Warren tells a 9-year-old trans boy that she's going to give him a veto on his on her selection to run the Department of Education, and then a year later, right, that the House promulgates rules. The House of Representatives promulgates rules saying that we're not going to use gender exclusive language like mother and father, right, and we will now speak of birthing people, and so all of this. How did it happen, right? Like I don't quite have an answer, but it looks like a couple of things, right? There was the attainment of the goals of the LGBT movement, and it proved to be, in 1995, Andrew Sullivan wrote Virtually Normal, and who would have thought that this would really happen, right, in our lifetime?
Right.
It's very hard to put ourselves back into that mindset where it seemed like as remote as the abolition of slavery must have felt in 1830, right? Yeah. And of course, from the creation of the very first abolitionist societies until the Emancipation Proclamation, we're looking at 100 years, right? And so that was the media of that time, a certain lag, but this really an extraordinary thing, right? Because an institution that had existed for most of human history, right? It's total extirpation within some of the dominant societies at that time on the basis of a moral vanguard, right? So now we have a new moral vanguard, right? And that moral vanguard was able to take us from, you had a period of similar to the period now with the state laws, right? Like various, we actually had a Defense of Marriage Act, right? Which I believe was a piece of federal legislation that was signed by the Democratic president at the time. So obviously technology has speeded up the rate of metabolism of new ideas. There was a recent essay in the Times op-ed section, sort of arguing that like cancel culture works. We would not have gay marriage without it, and sort of basing their argument on there were very well-funded lobbies that were pushing against it, and the exposure of that and then shaming campaigns showed us the tremendous potency, and eventually like pushed all of those opponents out, right? And that was sort of the argument. It's a powerful argument. And so we created a mechanism between the federal agencies, a kind of iron triangle within the Democratic Party, the federal agency, the executive agencies, and the activist class, right? And of course the gay rights movement is the most, lavishly funded, right? Like all of the various activist movements, it has the most kind of like supportive corporate America on its side, and the opponents of it were made into moral pariahs, and an economic cost was extracted from them, so they removed themselves from the field. So you have this tremendous machine, right, for creating social change. You attain this tremendous thing that for the most part we all agree is a tremendous moral achievement. What do you then do with the machinery, right? And so right around that time, Freddie DeBoer in Politico wrote a piece saying like polyamory has to be next, right? Or polygamy has to be next, right? Like we have to end we've ended the one man, we've ended the man-woman part. Now we have to end the one part, right? So that was his proposal. And of course, there are in fact moral entrepreneurs who include many people in the media activists, the media, industry who are trying to meme this into existence with some success. And but no, it was actually they went another way, and they went a way that proceeds from one of these premises of the successor ideology, which is this thing that you thought of as one of the sort of conditions of mammalian life, right? Like the distinction is in fact, and of course there are pre-existing feminist critiques that feed into this, that like, if we can just get beyond,
right,
there will be less violence, there will be less abuse, I wrote an essay observing the fact that people at a certain point, right around 2017, left essayists stopped saying that like, we're in a fight against sexism and racism, and started to say they were in a fight against whiteness and masculinity. And so like the claim is that there is an inherency, these forms of identity exist by virtue of their oppression of other categories, and have to be dismantled as such. And so on the one hand, it is framed as, diversity, tolerance, inclusion, familiar liberal values, but there's also this other dimension of that, like, of a kind of utopian vision that is actually very sincerely held by a lot of young people today, the thing that and certainly men commit violent crimes at rates 10 to 13 times that of women. The thing that holds us back, right, is the continued cultural recognition or existence of this thing that in a socially constructed world made out of discourse, we have it within our means to eradicate. And
masculinity, you mean?
Yeah, or gender difference,
right.
or just turning it into a form of creative play, right? Because the trans man doesn't necessarily become an evil oppressor, right? Like once they make the transition, turning it into a form of like benign and innocuous play that saps it all of all the toxicity, right? And so like ultimately it's so there was a piece by the name is escaping me, but it was a piece that kind of ended up naming what the successor ideology was. And it was like, we have to decolonize, we have to abolish, and this means emptying the prisons. It means, ending distinctions between, gender, seeking a real freedom, and really sort of pursuing the kind of, and this of course comes from this kind of Foucauldian investigations of various forms of normativity, because of course, and it's the paradigmatic Foucauldian project, because just a few years ago, right, like gender dysphoria, of course, because we want to keep it in a medicalized frame, we still use the term, but it was a form of mental illness that sometimes could be treated in a certain way, and it has in just about 10 years, in no small part through people yelling at medical researchers and getting them fired if they persist in the old views, and making moral pariahs out of people, including the best-selling, female author in the world, and including the author of the African female author of We Should All Be Feminists, right, who said, well, trans women are trans women, right? Like all of these people instantly become moral pariahs, and it's a billionaire, J.K. Rowling, can survive that onslaught. The point of the Inquisition is not the billionaire, is to show everyone else who is not a billionaire that, they cannot hope to, they cannot hope to, withstand even the amount of, plain speaking that I'm doing here, right? Like this is grounds for, claims of harm and of genocide directed at the university, investigations and so on. Things have happened to people for less, right?
And what's interesting, one thing that, so you raise an interesting point here, which is that a lot of the moral force of this activism depends on an idea that is outmoded by its own ideological underpinning, which is universal notions of equality. So equality and equity, which are really, equity is simply a kind of practical application of the principle of equality. That's an old universalistic claim. It's not clear, or rather it's quite clear that you actually can't assert any sort of normativity on the postmodern basis. So it has a kind of self-devouring character intellectually, but not politically. There's a way in which that contradiction is not something that's felt, because we still at heart are kind of committed egalitarians, and that's kind of the fuel or the frame on which the car runs. But it's so it's interesting to see it doesn't seem to be self-undermining in practice.
So the argument, the argument against this kind of Nietzschean politics, right, is that, well, if everything is just power, then power is going to dominate, right? And so we have to have actual normative standards that can hold power to account. But we have this thing where this kind of this antinomian, right? This anti-foundationalist discourse somehow, through this process of sort of protest, and captured the moral establishment, right? And so that it's the Ford Foundation and the Mellon Foundation because it is the consciousness and it is the sort of moral lingua franca, the grounds of justification of a certain class of activists who are held by the institutions. And so what we did was we took this kind of abolitionist energy and this premise that, and we made it a career. and so there's a certain category of job activists that where there's entrepreneurial activity, right, to get contracts, consulting contracts for themselves, to create a demand for their services that then also gets taken up by the sort of the dynamics of bureaucratization, bureaucratic growth. And so we've combined a kind of capitalist bureaucratic growth imperative, and we have married it to this bizarrely effectual form of discursive conjuring into existence of monsters that one can fight, but that one is always in the process of reconstituting so as to continue that fight. And so one way of thinking about this is that for Fukuyama, the end of history just means that there isn't going to be a final stage of proletarian revolution that will reconcile all the contradictions of liberal society, right? And that's all it means, right? And we're just not going to go to a next stage because we tried it, and that stage actually, didn't end up being an improvement. But obviously, people are still unequal, right? We are formally equal, but you can reach a certain equilibrium where any advances in someone's rights or their recognition necessarily has to be zero sum, right? And so what we end up seeing here is there is a desire for, Fukuyama talks about the terminal nostalgia, the terminal boredom at the end of history, and this nostalgia for great causes. And in response to that nostalgia for great causes, we manufacture new causes. We redefine we redefine what it means for us to be equal, and we actually say, and there's always a vanishing horizon. So something that I tweet about was, there was a story in Publishers Weekly about, the headline was kind of like, no progress on diversity, but you looked at the actual figures, and the figures showed that like within the publishing industry, it was like 73% women. It was like, like 10% gays, which is like twice the rate in the general population. And, 86% cisgendered. And that was, and so like non-cisgendered at a rate much higher than the general population. But it was still presented as, well, we're so far from equality, right? And so this is an example of there's an unappeasable appetite. There's also a desire for this kind of continued activity, and then there is the inability to say, well, we actually passed that threshold, right? And so like, in the broader economy, there were books that came out in 2008 and 2009, I've referred to them, a book called The Richer Sex, referring to women, and also, The End of Men, sort of, they were somewhat sensationalizing in the way they framed things, but it was true that we passed the point where, there are more female managers than male managers in today's economy, right? And so if you have a boss, your boss is more likely to be a woman than a man, right? Like in the private economy. So, and yet, right, like we still remain within patriarchy, we still remain within white supremacy. And so like our incapacity to kind of, our inability to kind of metabolize these new facts and talk about how things actually are, because there is an organized interest on behalf of the persistence of this problem that they exist to fight, right, is part of. And then sort of like the need to, all of the sort of incoherencies and the internal contradictions that emerge makes it so that like one must police with ever greater severity in order to kind of hold together this thing that would otherwise on its own, agenda sort of, fall apart. And that would also sort of, centrifugalize, like, why is it necessary for, the BLM movement that is based upon police violence, police brutality in the inner cities, to say that like, well, no one is free until the Black trans woman is free, to say that like, our agenda is to dismantle the nuclear family requirements, right, and live in villages and so forth. The answer is that these activist organizations by default are always, why is it necessary for, the gay parade in Toronto to include Palestinian activism, to refuse Israeli participation? It's sort of like, well, they attained many of the goals of the movement. So in addition to like creating a next goal, which is the sort of eradication of gender, they also have to involve themselves in all other forms of oppression. And it's the people who feel that they must always speak of every form of oppression, and they must see every form of oppression built into the very structure of reality.
Right, because it's a unitary explanation.
Those people are the successor ideologists. We don't have a word for them. If somebody can come up with a better word for them, I don't know. Successor ideology is a bit of an oxymoron and a bit of a redundancy, right? Like all ideologies are successor ideologies to some degree. Successor ideology, though, emerges, because like Marxism was a successor ideology that promised to it promised to
be successor,
It promised to fulfill the unfulfilled promises of liberalism, right? In the failure of Marxism, right, then emerges this other thing, this other much more heterogeneous thing that nonetheless, right around 2015, as it acquired the power of social media, also acquired this weird sort of unreal and yet unity to it. And so the person who's likely to say X is also going to say Y.
Right.
And so like if a person has he, him in his, he, him, autistic, ADHD, like in his, right, in his bio, you can guess a lot of other things about his opinions. And that person is a successor ideologist.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's very clarifying. So I want to get to some questions. So this is from David Leibowitz, a recent AU graduate. He writes, it seems that the two possibilities of perceived inequality between groups are either A, the fault of white people, or B, natural inequalities between groups. The idea of the successor ideology seems to encapsulate the idea that the lack of racial, ethnic, and sex-based equality can be summed up as being the fault of white people alone, given that white people make up 60+% of the United States. To what extent do you think that we will see an anti-liberal backlash that entertains or accepts the other possible theory among the white majority, right? A white supremacist backlash. Given that this theory goes against liberal American notions of natural human equality, to what extent will this potential counter-belief be destructive to the political and social status quo? Yeah, doesn't this set the stage for the white supremacists to take this up? And
people say that, and I said something similar to that myself in an essay where I was kind of like, oh, there was a poll recently in which 40% of respondents, and these are not just white respondents, agreed with the statement, white people are under attack in America, right? And I sort of, and so that kind of, and there is this kind of like, oh, this is going to feed into, and it feeds reaction, and I think it does to some degree feed reaction, but there are other explanations besides natural inequality. It's just a matter of like what, like culture exists by virtue. Culture is a machine for producing disparate outcomes, right? Like culture is a machine for orienting people in one direction and not the other. So there's this great photo of the story was America defeats the Chinese in the math Olympiad, and there's like a photo of like 5 Chinese American guys, right? And really the thing that we have to be able to get to is the moment where we can take that picture and put it alongside the picture of the USA Olympic basketball team and say, this is actually what it means for diversity to be our strength, right? And of course, and none of this requires inherency. It just means that like a self-selected group of immigrants to the United States includes a lot of math-oriented people. And the history of the evolution of African Americans is such that they have a large role in generating the soft power of the United States in terms of its vernacular culture, as well as its athletics. And we don't need to inquire further than that to say that, given those choices that individuals under the influence of culture have made, of course, there is this problem where you do have people that are pushing us ever further toward that kind of the binary choice that person posits, and one devoutly hopes for and seeks to do in one's writing to see to it that we avoid that polarization of choices, because those are actually it's like a false choice, right? And so it's to the extent that we can have any influence on the discourse, one should be insisting upon the one of the two non-toxic, right? Like one of the non-toxic of 3 different ways of looking at the fact of human difference.
Right. Yeah. Excellent.
And the correct one. So
yeah, that too. Prita Gobble, who's an AU undergrad, writes, thank you very much for an interesting conversation. 2 questions if you can get to them. What is ultimately the solution to the problems raised by the successor ideology? Cancel culture curbs people's willingness to speak out against such ideological fever, and as a result, many conform. Both people on the left and the right agree that there are real injustices like racism, but how can you convince or educate people to resort to prudent reform rather than radical change. Many of the debates around successor ideology and progressivism seem to center around the divide between white people and black people. How do other groups, particularly Asians, and the perceptions of them as being model minorities play into all of this? So, okay, so these are two questions. One is what's the alternative? How do we address these problems without getting pulled into these sorts of presumptive, these modes of framing the problems, and then the other is how do Asians in particular play into this way of framing the problem?
Well, so the whole Asian thing, which I'm going to take first, of course, is very interesting because the whiteness critique that we were talking about, like the whiteness focused model as an explanation, it emerged in the 90s. But it only really kind of took root and became mainstreamed very recently. And it's doing so at precisely the moment, right, where it is like objectively untrue, right, by virtue of, what a group of non-white, immigrants have managed to do in the country. And we can know pretty sure that various cultural practices and so on, because the kind of the Asian white achievement in education, but also along almost every other dimension of sort of health outcomes, of longevity, of likelihoods to commit a crime or be the victim of a crime, and so forth, right? And as well as individual income, not wealth, since Asians have not been here very long. But the gap is large and it's growing. So like there's a kind of 0.4 standard deviation gap on testing, but also on grades, right, between the median white student and the median Asian American student. And so the thing we can know for sure on the basis of that fact that if there is an invidious structure of success in this country, it's not whiteness, right? It's some other thing. We just call it a kind of bourgeois propriety and it may not be Asianness either. It may just be the thing that this self-selected group of migrants happens to bring with them. But the one thing that we know that it isn't is it's not whiteness, right? And so, and it's like, okay, I now stand accused of participating in the more model minority myth, right? Like, despite the fact that like the facts bear this out, right? And the model minority myth is the practice of white supremacy as the ultimate cause of all things in the society, pitting Asian Americans against others by allowing them to succeed so as to spite other groups and disprove what is in fact the compelling reality, right, of the incapacity of non-white people to prosper. Of course, so like between the years 2014 and 2019, the group whose income rose the fastest in America were Hispanics, followed by Asian Americans. And of course, the Hispanics are at a lower base, but they are growing. And so this is significant. So, California in 2020, they brought, so like back in 1996, the demographic structure of California was such that it was already a majority non-white population, but it was still a majority white electorate. And that majority white electorate, they voted, in various referenda to, withhold, public benefits from undocumented immigrants, and they also voted to forbid racial preferences in government contracting and hiring and in college admissions. And so the idea for, back then, of course, was, well, we're going to reach a point where the demographics of the electorate are going to match the still changing demographics of the population. And of course, so, California was at the place in 1995 that, the country as a whole is going to get to in 2014 or 2015, or 2040 or 2045, right? And so it's a kind of sneak peek. And there was a kind of white reaction at that time that took that form. So the idea was like, oh, we're going to get to the point where it will be a white minority and we can take another bite of the apple and we can bring affirmative action back. and this is a question of like, well, we're going to continue affirmative action when white people have themselves become a minority, and of course the answer is yes, right? I mean, because what was once done out of sort of noblesse oblige now is done because one doesn't have the power to prevent it, right? And so they took the second bite of the apple. They did a couple of things. So you know, all of the great and the good of that society were, you know, corporate America and so on, were obviously behind the reinstitution of affirmative action. They were up against a handful of sort of ragtag, like conservative groups. The great and the good outspent the conservatives by, you know, 9-1. And, you know, the plurality Asian/Hispanic electorate voted against affirmative action by a larger supermajority than the kind of white electorate had done 30 years ago. And so they showed, and of course, the thing about affirmative action is like everyone announced that, oh, here we're fighting white supremacy, but it actually was like the largest plurality group, Hispanics, taking away things from another minority group, Asian Americans, right? That's what its practical impact would have been. Because, and so like the University of San Francisco's medical school, they went ahead and they gave us all a sneak peek of what the post, you know, sort of affirmative action back admissions would look like, right? And so a school that had been, whose entering class had been 60% Asian on the basis of only focusing on, you know, MCAT scores and grades and so on, was like in the mid-20s, right? So they reduced the Asian score by like 40 points. Huh. And then they, of course, they boosted the Black and Hispanic to like, you know, 20%, and whites actually gained a little bit, right? And so this is actually what tends to happen when they have measures that kind of devastate the number of Asian Americans who are allowed in. And those Asian Americans were already meeting a higher bar, right, in terms of their MCAT scores, because by doing so well, they put themselves in a position where, well, they end up competing with themselves, and so you as an individual applicant have to, you know, you're thrown into this crab barrel where you have to beat out everybody else. So that was that, and they did that while the law was still 1996, right? Like they didn't even wait until they were allowed to do it. They just went ahead, in keeping with this general willingness that I referred to earlier, to just defy the law, right? Because there is an elite consensus. There's a new elite consensus that was manufactured through a kind of political correctness on steroids that made it such that like these policies would go through, they would not be scrutinized, there would not be deliberation, there would not be debate, there will certainly not be dissent, because dissent brings consequences. And so like all of that happened, and you know, but they went to the people. These things almost never go to the people. Whenever do they go to the people and they seek their democratic, you know, sanction, they always come up with the same answer. And so even after the population tip happened, it turns out to be the case that the group, Hispanics, right, that were the fastest growing, whose income saw the fastest growth over the last 5 years, and the group that came right behind them, Asian Americans, actually like, you know, are kind of down with the American system in its pre-equity agenda form. And that's what we learned. Of course, then the UC Board of Regents, they had solicited a study of the SAT, asking, you know, they got a bunch of professors to study the question. The professors studied it for a year. They brought back a very thorough 200-page study showing it's not racially biased. It is predictive of certain outcomes. And therefore we should keep using the test. That was the formal recognition. It came in around like March 2020, right? And so, and then of course, you know, a guy dies in Minneapolis under horrible conditions, and all bets are off. And so they're going to get rid of the test, and they're going to engineer their outcomes, even in the presence of like the prior law. Right, and the vote is for naught, right? And so it's this combination of a kind of like elite politics, you know, jurists on the one hand, administrators on the other hand, who simply, you know, feel they have a moral mandate consistent with this ideology, that not just a mandate, but like a duty to a higher duty, a higher calling to disregard the view of the populace. What does that do? That then generates a will to revolt. And if no one from the political class is willing to represent what turns out to be the will of the people, that creates opportunity for a demagogue to emerge. So this refers to, the previous question, the kind of the ratcheting up into an ever more kind of like more volatile and higher variance world on the basis of a moralized refusal to represent certain interests. So decreeing back in 2015, right, that the correct word is undocumented citizen, right, to refer to, that is a kind of open borders of the mind, right? And so that open borders of the mind then doesn't just take disciplinary power and police contrary views out of existence. It permeates the atmosphere of governance itself, because it's ultimately elites who govern us. It's elites who take the sort of inchoate impulses of the people and translate it into policy, or refuse to, because we have this moralized politics that then emerges. And so, and so if there is a constituency within the Republican Party, and indeed we learned that there is, that actually wants to enforce the border, and feels like, oh, this is actually like a function of our sovereignty as people, that we can distinguish between citizens and non-citizens, and that to will a border means to will the means to enforce the border. And we still have the stomach to do that, whereas there are other parts of this polity who don't have the stomach to do that, because of course, enforcing the border doesn't look so great if you look at it. If you look at it under Trump, and if you look at it under Biden, right? Like the babies in cages are there in both in both circumstances. It's just that the partisan dimension of it makes it so that it's a great moral emergency in one circumstance, and in the other circumstance, it's no one really cares, right?
And so this raises a really interesting question. So my colleague Tom Merrill asks, how do conservatives fit into your story? How does Trump fit into your story? Wouldn't advocates of the successor ideology say that Trump confirms some important parts of their view? I mean, there are a couple of, so this is an ideological question and a political question. Take your pick.
Sure. I mean, look, remember what Bernie Sanders, the first thing he said about Trump, which is, if he does wrong, we will fight him to the death. But if he does right, brings infrastructure bills and these other noises that he's made, we're going to work with him, right? But then Charlottesville happened, right? And that was the end of that possibility, right? And who knows to what extent that possibility was sort of honestly presented or what. I think he meant it, who knows? And so, look, if you are the party that is also aligned with the administrative state, the intelligence community, the national security state, the media, and you regard an election as illegitimate, what do, right? You call Robert Mueller, right? You leak a bunch of stuff, right? And you do what was then done. If you have the institutions of legitimacy on your side, if you are a rabble, right? You show up at the Capitol and you confirm everything everyone has said about what a monstrous rabble you really are, and justify a war on terror against yourself, a domestic war on terror against yourself, right? And so that kind of answers my question about conservatives, right? It's like you had people who you had people that want to enforce the border for reasons fair or foul, and the system did not want to represent them. They turned to the demagogue. The demagogue then in turn, right, ended up and so there's a feeding in through his utterances at Charlottesville, but also the way that those utterances were processed and manufactured and then memified and so on, that ended up being confirmatory of this fascism narrative that was present from day one, and that turned out to be excellent business, right, for MSNBC and CNN. And so there's this state of exception that then set in, and this sense that, like, in our fight against literal white supremacy in the White House, we have a moral mandate, but also an obligation to moral clarity in reporting, and to become an organ of a kind of resistance, right? And so that happens, and that, and of course, all of those atmospherics persuade people who were not previously persuaded that no, in fact, the views of the critical race theorists of a transhistorical, right, all-pervading white supremacy that sometimes takes innocuous forms, but at any point where it is threatened, is always willing to don the hood and reveal itself in all of its terror. Was ended up being vindicated in their minds, even though there was and of course there a lot of idea laundering within academia, social science. There's a great paper by a Columbia sociologist named Musa Al-Gharbi, where he sort of looked at like all of the studies showing that, like, racial resentment and so on were the cause of the reason people voted for Trump. And he really shows that it's a heavily oversold narrative, where kind of like responding to the state of exception, the partisan need, scholars pitching in, and also serving themselves, right, through that response. It's actually not. It doesn't really hold together. There's a lot of reasons why. A certain faction of the country loathes our elite to the point where that they derive a kind of satisfaction by electing the class clown, which at a national level, I think is sort of a lot of what motivated that gesture. And I don't want to make, like, I don't want to be I'm going to be accused of being an apologist for this aberrant phenomenon. In many ways, it is an aberrant phenomenon. But it does not change the fact that the group, right, who benefited most for many of those years from the economy of those years was Hispanics, and in fact that group did in fact see a tilt toward Donald Trump. Now I remember back in the summer of 2019, and I think this was at the height of the babies in cages stuff, right? There were a handful of polls showing, like, Hispanics approved of Donald Trump by more than 50%, right? And I was going to write a piece. I ended up talking to Roy Teixeira about it at a conference, and he was like, "No, it's probably like there's no reason to think it's going to bear out in the actual results." And then, like, the day of the election, a story came out that the most Hispanic Mexican American town in America, that is 94% Mexican on the border, like, switched to Trump by something like 40 points, right? Like over Hillary. And then, Vice did some reporting. They went there, they found out what this was about. Look, the people who are most directly exposed to not just economic competition, but some of the other problems that sometimes come with mass illegal immigration are in fact those who arrived just before them, right? And so it seems like a very counterintuitive finding. And of course, the sort of critical race theory coalition then they wrote various articles trying to explain this away. One of them was a very memorable one in the Washington Post, sort of arguing that there was such a thing as multiracial whiteness. That was then, and of course, and we see they're being very explicit about the fact that whiteness is just like a term to fill in the gap for anything evil. So Yeah.
That's the social cause par excellence. Yeah, great. We're running out of time, so this will be the last questions from my colleague, Alan Levine. Many thanks to Wes for bringing clarity to a murky but omnipresent new idea. I'd like to hear more about Wes's idea that the successor ideology, quote, cannibalizes institutions without which a modern society cannot exist.
Oh, that's just a reference to police and prisons.
Oh, police and prison. Okay. Can you please explain?
Yeah.
Let's see. Can you please explain how the logic of successor ideology will paradoxically and perversely destroy a handful of key institutions? So I guess.
Well, I mean, you know, it seems like Democrats are now saying we never supported,
right.
you know, defund, and you know, so
right.
They're going to be able to. I think they're going to be able to pivot away from these things. You know, I mean, the successor ideology in a way is a kind of fantasy politics, right? This kind
right.
of unity of all oppression are things that are posited. They sort of, they're not real, but in their very unreality, they manage to impinge upon politics in all sorts of ways. And so, you know,
there may be racism and oppressions of various types, but the unity seems to be unreal, and the
unity is unreal, and that the remedy for racial disparities in policing is abolition of police or prisons is unreal, right?
Right.
You know, the trend over the previous 15 years is already discarceral, and rightly so, right? And so, like the percentage of the number of black men in prison, right, has declined by 30% over 15 years, and that's not a small amount, right? And it did so in part because of a bipartisan movement in you know, bankrolled in no small part by the Koch brothers, right, for a less carceral society. So there already was right a consensus behind this, and we were already moving in those directions, and that movement in that direction is not small, right? And yet nonetheless the activist class, you know, is not responsive to reality. They were responsive to cause-oriented donors, right? That are the sort of their kind of reason to exist in a way. And so nonetheless they still, you know, they produce the same things wherever they are. And so in terms of, like, they produce meltdowns, they produce, and so I forget the name of the, you know, she was a non-white mayoral candidate, and she was seen as one of the most progressive and, you know, on, you know, speaking the language of defunding the police and so on, and speaking the activist language of bodies and spaces and systems of oppression and so on, and therefore was staffed by those who speak that common language. And those who speak that common language tend to, you know, take the parlor game that I was just describing and turn it into a series of, you know, struggle sessions. And that is what happened there. There was you know, a kind of perception that the existence of people at different levels with different levels of experience who got different levels of salary was a form of oppression, and was cause for, you know, internal revolt, you know, meltdowns on social media, and of course the campaign flamed out sooner afterwards. It's unclear what its prospects would have been otherwise, but this is a recurrent pattern. This actually happened in the Elizabeth Warren campaign as well, you know, where, you know, there were these kind of, and it happened in the Democratic National Committee, where, you know, you know, most of the most experienced figures, in part because many of them were white, not all of them, you know, were all sort of purged, you know, on the basis of these claims. And so, you know, the kinds of struggle sessions and the dramas that were, they were a part of the civil rights movement, and they were definitely a part of the kind of like the Black nationalism period. They were a part of the kind of confrontations between the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground. And of course, the Weather Underground were, of course, like white ultra-radicals who were interested in counterproductive violence, just as the, you know, sort of, in many cases, right, you know, you would have kind of white radical Antifa members, or, you know, sort of, it's just an idea, not an organization, but like, you know, white radicals, you know, burning down, right, and attacking Black neighborhoods, you know, in some cases, you know, to the consternation of the people that they are, you know, are ostensibly there in defense of. these are all old dynamics. These are dynamics that are familiar to people in left activist spaces. These are familiar to people who, read George Orwell on the Spanish-American War. This is now a part of corporate America, right? Like this is like it has gone big, and this is certainly a part of academic politics and everyday life. It keeps advancing into areas, and it always produces the same things. Eventually, it produces burnout. So in terms of like, well, I think probably it will burn itself out, but like it could, I don't know the time frame. It could be 15 years. It could be sooner than that. There is this funny thing where it is obtaining its power now, but it also sort of feels like the Brezhnev times, in that like so many disbelieve and so many grouse privately about it. So it's that funny combination of, are we at the beginning of a new Christian age, right? And so the model I use is like, look, the Cold War was a bipartisan consensus about the purposes of the state, and that lasted for a long time. The War on Terror was a kind of weak consensus that didn't last that long, and that ultimately didn't survive the actual weakness of the threat, right? And now the kind of white Trump revanchism and so on. It's a new kind of partisan elite. It's not bipartisan. It is a form of elitism. It is driven by, but it is driven by unanimity among corporations. Like corporations are willing to put themselves out there repeating Biden's misinformation, right, about like a partial restoration of the voting status quo ante prior to 2020, is Jim Crow, right? But you have like major CEOs like signing on to that, because of course, like the New York Times and the Washington Post did have to fact check Biden's claims to this. And, so we still do have normative liberal institutions that sometimes, right, like feel that it's in their interests to debunk obvious falsehoods. And they did do that. But Biden continues to repeat that rhetoric. And that rhetoric continues to be adopted by like leading figures in American life, regardless of its reality. Like that, this is all a function of the fact that we built a machine for overriding reason with emotion, and that there are, I'm referring to social media here, and then in the kind of anti-Trump mood, there was a need for a new, because the kind of neoliberal consensus and the kind of Obama, sort of United States, his attempt to through the example of his own personhood, right, sort of reintegrate the country into a coherent whole, sort of ended in the kind of racial acrimony that then into Trump, right? There was a kind of need for something to serve as a glue, and there's just a kind of path dependency about the kind of out of the box solutions that happen to be out there. And it's just, it just so happens that the out of the box solutions involves like telling almost every corporate employee in America that individualism and objectivity are white supremacy culture, right? Like, how did that happen? It happened not because there was any thought to it. It happened because like you had these entrepreneurs that happened to be in business at a moment where like people needed to make a gesture. It just so happens that like we brought in this ideology that now produces this kind of like massive preference falsification. Like pollsters have told 62% of people, respondents told pollsters that they hide their true political opinions. And so this kind of, those who hung out with, and I was only on the outskirts as a college student among anarchists and Stalinists, right? Like they know these dynamics very well. a lot of other people who had no reason to think ever in their lives that they would be exposed to it are now being exposed to it, and that's what's happening.
Well, it's a fascinating story. We're a good bit over time, but thank you so much for taking the time to go through this. Wes Yang Substack is the year zero, and
so it's wesleyyang.substack.com. Yes.
Wesleyyang.substack.com. Okay. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for showing up.
Okay.
Bye-bye.